Hello everyone and welcome to week 4 in the course of Media Games and Creative Industries. The theme of this week is the politics of gender, race and sexuality in the digital games industry and games culture. So we're switching gears a little bit. We were talking a lot about the industry. Now we switch a little bit to talk more about the content of games, but we actually still talk about the politics of production and the politics of consumption of games. This is the plan for today, for this lecture. So first I just want to do a very brief recap of what is game studies. And the reason why I want to do that is just to highlight the complexity of video games research and more or less where this research of gender, race, sexuality about video games, where it's situated, right? Where does it come from and what is my take on it from a political perspective. Then we'll talk more about gender, sexuality, race, look at video games as a political medium, and think about some case studies which are basically related to the game I researched, Mass Effect Trilogy. Let's get started by discussing a little bit about the field of game studies. I've mentioned before in our very first lecture that game studies is not something new. And in fact, the study of play and game date from very, very early stages of social research. In particular, the work of Johan Huizinga and Roger Calois are very important, as I mentioned last time. So they are kind of the foundation of our studies of play and game. Later, but still also connected to especially Roger Calois, we also have Brian Sutton Smith thinking of game as this kind of rule-based system, right? And then we can think of the rules behind any sort of game. So how do you move pieces on a chess table? Another point that is interesting is the contribution of symbolic interactionism to game studies, that are then starting to think of games and play as parts of everyday interaction and how we talk about games, how we interact with games. And this dates to quite a long time ago with the studies of George Mead, who back then was talking about play and how we behave with other people in situations of play, which is later on took back by Goffman and his concept of the gaming encounter that I personally quite appreciate. And the gaming encounter can be anything, right? It's not connected to digital games. 1961, digital games were starting to appear, but definitely not in any sort of scale outside of some small labs in certain universities. So when Goffman was talking about the gaming encounter, he was talking about situations like a game of chess and other games that we could play at the time, a game of shogi, a game of mahjong, etc. Then, as a more modern take on it, we have the approach from ludology, which we already mentioned before, that really looks at games as a unique object of study, as an object of study that deserves a field of its own and a series of theories and etc. of its own to really be understood. And alongside it, we had the narratology scholars that were then looking at games as a new way, a new place for storytelling and narrative to take place. So a lot of the kind of core of game studies is here. A lot of the main readings and etc., if we're thinking about game studies, is here. But what happens when a new challenger comes into play? And by new challenger, I'm talking about these guys, digital games, which are very different from the types of games we had before and the types of games that a lot of these people are talking about, except from the ludologists and narratologists, which are then talking about digital games specifically. Everyone else was talking about a completely different kind of game. So when video games come to play, they seem like they fit quite well everything else. But the more I read about video games, the more I read about this kind of research, the less I felt that it actually really fit the bill. It is there, it's connected there, but it doesn't really fit 100% with just game studies, or better said that game studies alone is not enough to understand video games. In fact, we need some other things to really understand and grasp what a video game is in a current society. So can we say that there is such a thing as video game studies? Maybe. Maybe we are actually witnessing the birth of something very specific, a kind of study that is really focused on games and video games, or the digital gaming, that is considerably different from, say, research on board games. Even though they're all games, they're all rule-based systems, but they differ in many ways. So some of the different approaches to video games, of course, game studies helps us understand it, but also cultural studies, digital humanities, psychology and media effects, especially a lot of research about video games and violence comes from this. And of course, gender, race, queers, and sexuality studies. And these are just a few, there's definitely more, as you're going to see soon. Because that's not all. Remember in the first lesson when I highlighted the several approaches, several different kinds of research that are done about video games? We saw already about video games as an industry, which I actually didn't really mention there, which has a subset of theories and a subset of approaches of its own, maybe from economic perspective, from a political economy perspective, and etc. If we think particularly and specifically about identities in video games, right? Because that is our focus of today. If we just get one box out of those words, there's a ton of things, and that's what I'm going to try to cover today. A first subdivision, or a first area of interest in the realm of digital games research is this one connected to gendered, white and heteronormative gaming circuit. What do we look at when we're researching this? Say we're doing research on industry demographics. So it's still connected to the production of games. If we're looking at, for example, the different demographics in a studio, how many males are producing games, how many females, how many transgender people, how many black people, how many Asian people, and etc., etc. If we start to looking at these demographic categories, what happens there, right? That's what we're looking at here. And mostly, when we do this kind of research, the idea is to challenge this gendered, white and heteronormative gaming circuit, which by definition means that you're doing a little bit of cultural studies as well. But you can of course approach it from a feminist theory perspective or a queer theory perspective, which are all critical perspectives that are challenging dominant hegemonic notions. We also have to think about patriarchy, so how the patriarchy plays a major role in the kind of games culture we have nowadays. We've talked extensively about how male-dominated this industry seems to be. We know now that it's not really the case in terms of how many people play games. It's really diverse, the base of people that play games. But still, the big players in the industry, the big companies, still think and believe from a very patriarchal perspective that boys are the ones interested in games, men are the ones interested in games. And that's a stereotype that is very pervasive in our society. Other aspects you could research within this theme, you could look at the cultural dynamics of play. How is it when people sit at the couch over there, that is right in front of me, and are playing a game together? What happens if I'm playing there with my non-existent girlfriend? Which kind of dynamics of play can appear there? There's a very interesting study by an author called Ellen Thornham, and she researches the different kinds of play that happen in the home space. And it's very, very interesting how most female players, they see their play as very, subordinate to the play of their male partners. And that is interesting because that reflects this gender-wide heteronormative gaming circuit that is so pervasive, that is such an ingrained idea that it's difficult to come out of it. And if you read her work, you see these kind of reflections being made. And you can think about yourselves as well. How many of you in the first day of class, especially the girls from the group, said that I used to watch my cousins play, or I watched my brother play, or I used to play with my brother. But was it ever, can you think, was it ever the first activity for you, or it just came for you through this male channel, right? I know it's not the story for everyone, but it's a story that repeats itself quite a lot. We can look at who plays and why do they play, of course, as we already mentioned a few times before. Who plays, why do they play, can be, I play games for fun, and then it has maybe nothing to do with identity and gender, but maybe there is, and investigating that further is important. We can look at fans and fandom, and which kinds of fans and fandoms do we have within games culture. There's a lot, for example, when we look at Gamergate cases or the fandoms related to AAA games like Call of Duty and etc. that are very gendered. Recently, and slightly trigger warning here because I'm going to talk about a murder. So recently in Brazil we had this very sad case of a Call of Duty mobile player that was a female Call of Duty mobile player that was murdered by a male player of Call of Duty as well. So they used to play together and she was murdered by him, and he reacts in a quasi-psychotic way to it. And as much as we could not think about games in that case, it's impossible not to, because it is this kind of overly masculinized, over-masculine culture that can create a very toxic environment that then becomes dangerous to women, that makes them less prone to participating in that culture, and even when they participate, things like this can happen. It was a crime based on gender, and it was a crime that is also a result from a very toxic fan culture that dominates the gaming sphere to a considerable extent, and that's something we have to be concerned and worried about. Other aspects that we see a lot in this kind of research about identities is the idea of identities at play. So how do we identify with different game characters, or when we analyze game content and look for matters of representation of different characters, is there enough LGBTQ representation in gaming nowadays? Or think about The Last of Us 2 controversy last year, where you have this huge fan base that got really mad because there was two lesbian characters and they were not drawn to be the cliche hot lesbian, they were just normal looking people. So there was a lot of complicated discussions around that, which kind of representation happened in that particular game. And the same happens with different games. There's a lot of queer baiting in games where you create a discourse that makes it seem that a character is queer, but then it's never really fully revealed. We can think about gendered modes of play, so that we are even talking about how these things are designed, right? How these gaming interfaces are designed, how there is a big amount of discourse that video games like Wii Fit or consoles like Wii had a more family-friendly or female-friendly interface. Gender play spaces, so where can people play games? In still a lot of places or cultures you would look weird to a female frequenting an arcade, for example, or a LAN house, and etc. And we can also think about racialized play spaces, and that was particularly the case in Brazil, where access to gaming was and still is very limited. So you do create these sort of racialized play spaces where the majority of Brazilian population that has money is white, therefore they can play at home with their own game consoles. Whereas poorer communities, which are then mostly made of mixed or black individuals, they might have to go to certain stores where you pay to play for an hour or something like that. You have a more limited access, or you have to share a console with several other people, and etc. So even that can have a racial undertone in it, or which kinds of games do they play, and so on and so forth. So that's when it's important to think about here this word intersectionality, where you try to intersect these different identities and understand how they operate together into affecting how we play, which kinds of game we play, what comes out of it. And then more specifically, if we're looking at video games content, we tend to talk a lot about in-game representation. We can talk about hypersexualization, especially of female bodies, but also of male bodies. The absence or presence of marginalized publics, the absence of presence of diverse stories, so not stories that are always told by the point of view of a white male in either early 20s, late 20s, sometimes late 40s, kind of depends, but it's always kind of a male perspective of it. And the prevalence of this white male Western lead. Of course, a lot of games that are made in Japan do not have a Western lead, but some of them do. But of course, there's still a prevalence of this kind of stereotype. The last aspect that is interesting to investigate in this is the matter of sex and sexuality in games. I recommended you to take a look at the LGBTQIA plus archive that was organized by Adrian Shaw and some other researchers. It's a great archive that actually goes to show that even back in the 80s, you already had a lot of queer-oriented gaming and queer-oriented games with interesting queer characters. Hi guys, quick content warning / trigger warning. The upcoming images may be upsetting to some of you as they are connected to sex scenes, so there's some nudity, especially digital nudity, but also some images from Pornhub and other kinds of pornographic related websites. So if you don't want to look at these images, you can just listen to the audio, feel free to, and you notice when I change topics anyway. Thank you. We can also research sex in games, which is different from researching sexuality in games. When we're talking about sex, we're really talking about the physical act of sex. It's actually something that does not appear a lot in games, and it's interesting to just reflect on why. But it does appear as well, or it appears in more tame ways. And in 2007, when the first Mass Effect game came out, there was a big controversy at Fox News because Mass Effect had digital nudity, digital sex scenes with aliens and etc. But the truth of the matter is, and I can show you the video, so I'll just put it here, the sex scenes on Mass Effect 1 were pretty tame. And in fact, if anything, nowadays BioWare, that is the producer of Mass Effect and also Dragon Age, is a bit more, let's say, daring with their presence of sex. So you actually have a bit more naked bodies and etc. Whereas in the Mass Effect franchise, and this that made the American news and it was a big scandal at the time, kind of all false because they haven't even played the game. The criticism came from a place of not knowing what was actually going on in the game. So that is interesting to think about that. You can also think about how sex is a big part of games industry outside of just the game content itself. You have this presence of the geek girl, the gamer girl as a character in a lot of porn movies. So there's a kind of fetish going on with this type of girl. So you have all these porn movies where a guy's sitting there playing the game and that is kind of the kickstart for them to have sex, or the other way around, the girl's playing the game, etc. So there's a lot of fetish going on around it. You also have a lot of sexual content generated using game engines. So you remember game engines, the softwares and etc. that create the games themselves. So you have people that use the character design and etc., which is usually a fan practice to create pornography based on their game characters, animated pornography. Or you can have pornographic parodies of famous games as well. Mass Effect has a porn parody, for instance. So you can also discuss sex in games, but also how sex derives from games. And there are many ways to approach it. Sexuality in games, also a topic of importance there, which then is connected a lot to representation, so these diverse stories, marginalized publics. And you can do queer reading of games as well, where you approach a game from a queer theory perspective. So you're trying to uncover the different exhibitions of queerness in a game, or whether a character is being constructed as queer or not, if there's queer baiting going on or not, and etc. So while there is this considerable amount of studies regarding video games, gender, race and sexuality, and a diverse amount of ways to understand these topics, I decided during my research that I wanted to take it one step further. It's not to say that none of the research before mine wasn't political. Quite the contrary. If anything, 99% of any research that talks about gender, sex, race, it's going to be political in nature. But I wanted to make a bit more sense of that from a theoretical perspective, right? So I created my own sort of theoretical framework. I used way too many theories to do that, but it was a PhD, so I had time. I looked at symbolic interactionism, pragmatism as a ontological perspective, communication theories, and looking specifically to this praxeological approach to communication, that we see communication as symbols that are exchanged between people. It's an everyday practice, and etc. I'm not going to go into detail because it's not the goal here. I had several keywords that were important to me in understanding games. Configuration, which I mentioned before, the idea of interaction, because we're interacting with these digital media, experience, the different experiences that people have with games. That is a dialogical experience between you and the game, or between you and other players. So it's always a constant mutual exchange of symbols and signifiers and etc. And the idea of publics, which is then way too complex, there's no point in getting into it right now. And then I wanted to bring in a little bit of more traditional-ish political science research to it. So I was working with this concept of politics as scenes of dissensus, which I'm going to talk a little bit more soon. The idea of mediated deliberation, so media as places where we deliberate, where we talk about politics, and everyday political talk, everyday political conversation. How politics is just a topic among many others that we happen to talk on a daily basis, and we use several different resources to construct our own political stances, our own political ideas, and to just talk about them. And my hypothesis is that, okay, games are one of those, right? But how are games one of those? And it all builds up there into like more theories into these big mess that is video game studies. Just to clarify, when I'm talking about politics, I'm talking about something slightly different from what you might think politics is. When I say politics, most people will relate this immediately to what we call institutionalized politics. So the politics of elections and presidents and prime ministers and etc. All these kind of power games, right? But the concept that French philosopher Jacques Rancière brings of politics is quite different. I'll try to explain this here to you guys. Politics is an opposition between logics that count the parties and parts of the community in different ways. What he's trying to say here is that rather than limiting politics to something that happens only on institutionalized levels, politics is something that happens on everyday life, and politics is something we partake on. But not everyone is recognized as someone that partakes on the making of politics. And he has a term for that. He calls them the without part. The without part are the ones that are marginalized in society, the ones that do not hold any sort of real power in society. Their voices are silenced, their needs are neglected, and etc. by different governments. And what Hansier says is that politics is this constant opposition, this constant distribution and redistribution of what he calls the sensible. And then he divides it into two different areas. You have the police, and the police is not the police we see on the streets, but the police as a hegemonic power, the police as the consensus of society. So consensus ideas represent the police. Politics is then about a dissensus. Politics is about challenging this idea of the police, challenging these hegemonic normative ideals. It's really saying who can and who cannot participate and saying, well, that's not how it should be. Everyone should be able to participate in politics. So that's a little bit of what he talks about. I'm sorry if it's not very clear. It's a difficult thing to explain, and it's much easier to actually read and understand it. But the basic idea is that we have this division between the police, which we can consider the consensus, the idea that is consensual among everyone, things that are expected for everyone, which include patriarchal discourses of whiteness, imperialism, capitalism, and etc. And that we can challenge that as especially the marginalized publics, the without part, are the ones that can challenge that can effectively actually make what he calls politics, right? This dispute, this opposition between the logics and a challenge of these logics as well. I know the video is probably getting very long by now and I didn't realize it, but let's go through these just a little bit fast. So how are video games then a political medium? I present in three ways: the politics of production, the politics of content, and the politics of consumption. We already talked a lot about production. We are currently in what I call the sub-module of content in our course, and then the last 2 weeks we move on to the module of consumption. But I still want to talk a little bit more about each of them today, just briefly. Politics of production is, as I said before, a lot about what is going on in game studies and the people that make games. This is a picture of the development team or the people behind Mass Effect Andromeda, which is a sequel-ish to the Mass Effect franchise. I don't know how good it is, the image on the video, but just taking a quick glance to it, there's not a single black person in the picture. Maybe some black mixed person, maybe one, which I could say was mixed. There's 1, 2, 3 Asian people. There is maybe 3, 4 guys that look, they could be Latino. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 women. And everyone else is what we can call a white male. I can't say anything about the sexualities. It could be that everyone here is queer, and then all the argument goes to kind of stops existing. But I highly doubt that. But let's say that if we follow kind of the statistics of IGDA, that about 10-15% of the people here are queer. It's still not that many. But can you see how many white guys are making games, right? And Mass Effect is actually considered a progressive franchise. A franchise that tackles sexuality, gender, race in a pretty progressive way. So, yeah, praise for them. But it's still problematic, isn't it? And here we're talking about the main team. We're not really talking about the many others like small coders and etc. that were there, crunching through different sessions to get the game out there. Other aspect of politics of production is just the kind of games that are being made. and the kind of decision making that goes behind games. So here we have a character from Mass Effect 2, and I'm sure you already noticed that she has a considerable cleavage. And this cleavage is completely out of character. For who this person is in the game, it doesn't make sense that her design includes a cleavage. And if you get, unfortunately it's back in Brazil, but if you get one of the many guides of this game, but one book where they really discuss the design and etc., the ideas behind it, they actually went with this kind of sexy design on purpose. And the only reason we can give to it is that, well, hot girls sell more. Cleavage sells more. Boobs sell more. But really, did they need to do it? There were better designs of her that were thought previously, but this was what they came with at the end. So these are aspects as well that we can think when thinking of politics of production. We can also think, as we said 2 weeks ago, about the do-it-yourself games. Games that are then have a different logic of production, where diversity, where politics can appear in a different way. So I mentioned the game Dysphoria to you guys, and you saw it a little bit during our class. So that is one game that you can see a bit more of the identity aspects already being present, and the game in itself is basically kind of a little political manifesto in itself, right? Even though she's just telling a story of herself, but by doing so, by engaging with games to tell that story, that is already a powerful decision to say that it's also doing politics. Doing politics can happen in many, many different ways. We can also look at video games content to talk about it as a political medium. This is a screenshot from a game called Dragon Age Inquisition from BioWare, so the same producer, same developer as the Mass Effect trilogy. And the character you see here, his name is Krem. And Krem is actually a transgender character. Krem is not a playable character, but is a character that you have a good amount of interaction with throughout the game. Krem is a trans male character, which is even less common to actually see represented. And transgender characters are not common at all in games. You have a few that you can cherry pick here and there, but especially in AAA games like Dragon Age, really rare. So it was interesting to have that. On indie games, on the other hand, this can be more common. Down here you see a screenshot of a game called Always Sometimes Monsters, very interesting game. And the screen you see here, you don't know it. The first time you go to play this game, you're playing as a different character and you just go around this room talking to different people. And you don't know that. But the story actually starts when you kind of choose who you're going to hook up with. And then the person you hook up with actually becomes a character. So it's a bit of a gamble, and while you're playing, you don't know that, but you're deciding a lot of things about your character's race, gender, sexuality. Much later on in the game, you can actually also come out as a transgender person. And that's embedded in the narrative, even though it's a bit hidden in the narrative as well. So you have these matters appearing in video games content in different ways. These are just two examples, there are many others. Other examples that we can think, and these are from my interviewees back when I was doing my PhD. I think people underestimate video games at times. Video games can tell stories their own way. It's more interactive. It's when you have more control of the story. So a lot of the argument is that because you have control of the story, because you have a very different kind of engagement with video games than you would have with other different media, it is possible to engage with politics in a different way. We already saw in our very first class when we all played Super Burning World that games can be used to advance a political campaign, but games can also be used as tokens for political conversation about different society-wide topics. Casey Hudson was the producer behind, one of the minds behind Mass Effect trilogy. He says this in an interview he gave to a book. Video games can allow you to explore how you feel, but also about how you might do things that you can't do in real life. For example, to play a character of a different gender. Right? I could technically do that. I could cross-dress as a woman and go outside, but that would still not give me a full experience of what it is to be a woman. Games also do not give you a full experience of what it is to be a woman, but a good game with a good narrative can give you a different perspective on aspects that you did not think of before. And that can be very powerful in the right hands, in the hands of good game designers, good game writers. It can be really powerful and really life-changing. The amount of interesting and heartwarming stories that I've heard from players when I was interviewing them about Mass Effect, of how that game changed their life, is really interesting. And you see some of them here, and some of them are connected to these matters of identity politics. Then the last aspect that I like to highlight in terms of video games as a political medium is video games consumption. Now, what you see here is just some images that were created by different fans, so it's their way of engaging with the object they love so much, the franchise they love so much. So they'll create nice fan art, they'll create funny memes, they'll mix it with different media or different works of art here. So it's just something that fans do, right? And that in itself is nice. Is that in itself political? Depends. Sometimes it might be. None of these examples, I would say, are examples of political kind of fan art or political kind of user-generated content. But within fans and fandoms, good things can happen. These fan images, though, they are different. These fan images, they portray romances within the Mass Effect universe that are not allowed by the game itself, but they are created in their headcanons of their fandom. Especially between different male characters here. This is probably one of the most shipped male-to-male relationships ever. But also, and here we're talking more about allegories of race, when two very different races come together as well. Of course you see this here too, but here, because of how the game has a whole political plot involving a lot of xenophobia and etc. between these kind of two characters, then it builds up more on that. So just by creating these images, you're making a small but interesting political statement that these kind of romance should be visible, and should be visible and allowed in the game as well. That it should be there in the game. It's one of those things that is likely queer-baited in Mass Effect. But what happens then when we look at what the fans themselves are saying? One of my interviewees said this: "It was not Mass Effect that made me identify as a lesbian. I already identified myself, but I remember when I played, after playing it, I felt more comfortable in a certain way, of expressing this, like of not, shame was never the term, but maybe a little less guilt." So basically the idea is that she felt less guilty after playing the game, because the universe of Mass Effect naturalizes that very much, and by that she means queer relationships. So when I played that, the naturalization somehow passed to me. So it seems a little strange, right? You come back to the real world, and this being a lesbian then seems so transgressive, when there in the game that I was playing it's so natural. Another interviewee said that she only truly discovered herself as bisexual and accept herself as such 3-4 years ago at the time. And she said that that really influenced her way of playing any game. In RPG games, in which I can choose my characters, I give a lot of preference, 99% of the time, to female non-heterosexual characters. So when she can, she will play as a character that more closely resembles who she is. So the way we consume games can also be highly political, and these are just 2 quotes. I have way too many of them and a lot of interesting cases related to it. But it's interesting to know as well that the fans are not naive. The fans are not stupid. Right? They know that there is a capitalist logic behind these games, especially when we're talking about a AAA game. They know that these companies are not saints, that these companies have problems. So what Angelina is saying here, something I find very upsetting on BioWare games, is that they work on a very utopia world. Questions of gender are not treated, of sexuality not. These issues, they don't exist. It's like utopic, right? For example, on Dragon Age Origins, when you have the origin of the city elf character, there's a scene of rape, of harassment, that is not dealt with in-game. It just happens, and it's never really discussed in this game. And Mass Effect especially, this is never touched upon. Questions of gender, sexuality, never. They are represented. So you have a lot of gay characters, lesbian characters, and etc. But it's naturalized to the point that it was never a problem, or that everyone just now accepts it. So it's very utopian in the sense that, is that could really possible? Is that really possible? Shouldn't they problematize something at least? And she talks here also, especially between different races, because we may be saying that within the human race that was resolved, but what about the alien races? How do they make sense of gender and sexuality there? Of course, when the people that created these races for the game were also humans, and we have our own biases, we have our own limited understandings of what gender and etc. can look like in a game. So even the aliens, they are very human-like in every possible way. Rana says that there is still a lot of resistance, a lot of people doing stupid stuff, a lot of women being harassed in online games. I already said about the case of Call of Duty, but then this is a persistent problem in online gaming especially. Some of you mentioned already that you avoid using or speaking in online games so that you won't be harassed yourselves. So again, the consumption aspect of video game. So we as players, we also can experience different aspects of the political or this idea of politics in games. So these two quotes from interviewee named Joseph, they're quite interesting. Basically I asked them what do they think about video games being a political medium. I think it's fundamental. The problem is that a part of the gamer public, so to speak, is very conservative, and that is very true. In fact, there's a considerable fan base or considerable voter base of guys like Donald Trump in the US, or like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's a very extreme right candidate, that are hardcore gamers and really go and support that guy. So you see a lot of conservative discourses, but if you go to places like 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, you see that even more. We saw, problems like Gamergate recently. But despite this, I think it should not be a hindrance that games should still talk about politics, despite these people being against it. And then he highlights the issue of indie games, games that are not afraid to explore sexualities in other ways outside the norm of the heterosexual norm. And he thinks we are at a point where we can only move forward. His interview was back in 2016, so we are like 5 years ahead, and indeed things have gotten better. You do have more diversity in games, but it's still problematic. We, as society, we still see games too much as the domain of the 12, 13-year-old teenager, heterosexual, cisgender. And it's not like this. Robin says that basically everyone plays video games. Everyone I know that plays games is either not heterosexual or not a boy. And that is very true. When we actually go around and ask people who play games or not, you see that it's super diverse. And in fact, in some places we have more female playing games than male. And then it gets into the discussion, but is Candy Crush a game? Does it count? Yes, it counts. If you play in a game, it counts. It doesn't matter which game it is. It doesn't matter if you play once a week, once a month. If you're someone that engages with games and someone comes to interview you, do you play games? You can say, yeah, sometimes I do. Not very frequently, but I do. So yeah, everyone plays games, everyone can play games. So that is also an important aspect of political dispute. So when we're thinking about the police, the consensus within games industry and within games culture, a lot of the consensus is that there's this specific group of people and this specific group of games that actually count as gamers. And only by playing these games you count as a gamer. Only by being the white guy playing Call of Duty, the white guy playing kind of any shooter or an open world game like The Witcher, but you don't have just to play it, you have to complete it. So there's like specifics of how a gamer should look like. That is the police, that is the consensus. And what Robin's saying here, that well, it's not like that. There's a lot of opposition to these logics. There's a lot of politics being done by those that are considered marginalized within games culture. Queer developers, queer players. Female developers, female players. Black developers, black players, and etc. So it is a very diverse field. But how can we foster real diversity in video games? One way that we could do it is to get developers, to get everyone that is working with games or wants to work with games, to work with the experts, being them academics or not. They can be activists and etc. And by working with the experts, what you get is a broader perspective, is a more in-depth perspective and understanding of these different identities and different ways that you can actually have proper diversity in video games. You can also do a lot of workshops and talks to generate empathy, to raise awareness about the issues of lack of diversity, about the issues of stereotyping certain populations and reinforcing that stereotype through the products you're creating. So if you organize workshops, if you organize talks within your company, your game development company, chances are that your employees will then get to know a little bit more about it and be able to actually effect some change. A third aspect is you as a developer, you as a games researcher, you as someone that plays games. Are you doing diversity or plurality? And then there's a difference there. Plurality is just adding characters for the sake of it, adding diversity for the sake of it. It's what we would call the token, right? The token black character, the token gay character. That doesn't really matter, that doesn't really change anything. We need quality of representation. It has to be proper diversity. So these are some aspects that we can do to foster diversity in video games. But there are more, right? You as students, if you want to work in the games industry, how would you be able to tackle this? Maybe you have to rethink the hiring processes and adding more diversity through hiring. But we also might have to go back to the root of the problem. That is the lack of incentive for minority communities, marginalized communities, or female communities to join courses related to technical development. So like engineering, computer science, etc. So those are ways that we can foster proper diversity, real diversity in video games. A lot of it is in our hands to really move towards this change. I know some of you want to work in the industry, so do keep this in mind, please. That was it for today. It was exceedingly long, I know, because the sun is almost setting and the light has changed completely and I couldn't do anything about it because I didn't want to stop. So that's going to be a lot of work of color correction. Or not. It's not like you guys really care. So I'll see you guys next week. Bye bye.